Good morning, everyone. It's always good to be here. It's great to see you all each week. There are some new faces, and it's great to have you joining with us here. I know that most all of you have been joining with us at home and by live stream, and we're grateful for those who are doing so this morning. But it's always good to be able to see brothers and sisters face to face, and this morning is no exception to that at all. We are in the middle of a series that we're calling Why Believe, and it's a series of evidences is typically the way we categorize these kinds of lessons, where we're trying to give a defense or provide an explanation for why we believe what we believe about God, about the Bible, about our reasons behind that. And really the first three lessons in this series, which we have now completed, we're trying to give answers that explained or evidences for why we believe that God is, that God is the best explanation for the reality that you and I all experience. It's much easier, I think, to believe ultimately that there is an intelligent and wise and personal designer behind the universe than it rather just rose up out of chaos and by blind chance. And we've also seen that our only hope for justice really in this world and certainly in the world to come is if God exists and actually cares. And we've seen last week that the Bible is a reliable guide for history, that it explains to us events that actually took place. And specifically, Jared did a wonderful job of showing us how the life of Jesus and the resurrection in particular are grounded not merely in myth or speculation, but rooted in history itself. And again, the reason for why would we do this, we could go on at length about that, but a passage to begin with is found in 1 Peter 3:15, which says to all of us that we should always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have, and to do this with gentleness and respect. So what we want to be able to do, both me and Jarrett and Ben and whoever else stands before groups like this to preach, is be able to do what Peter calls us to do. But more than that, we're trying to design these lessons in such a way as to equip all of us to be able to do the same in day-to-day conversations at the workplace or in your home when your children ask questions about what they are learning at school. We're living in what's described as a secular age, and we are focusing our messages on arguments and ideas that are being presented in the dominant culture that we live in that are contrary to what we believe as Christians. And we want to provide good answers to that. And we want to do so in the way that Peter calls us to do so, with gentleness and respect. It's all too easy anytime we're debating, as it were, or putting a view of the world that we ascribe to up against one that we oppose. The temptation is always to cast the other person or group's point of view in as absurd and ridiculous light as possible, and to often resort to ad hominem attacks and other logical fallacies. Straw man attacks use the very weakest argument that you possibly could present from their point of view, and then you just smash it and declare victory. But in reality, that doesn't seem to be in the spirit of what Peter is calling us to do. And I think that if we really want to be able to contend in the world of ideas that we're living in, we want to understand as carefully as possible exactly what the other side is saying. And to do so with honesty, to represent not the weakest, but maybe the strongest case that they can present. And even if we may at times find that a little bit unsettling, it's nevertheless the quest for truth that we're after. And if we can present the strongest case made by the most articulate proponents of humanist and secularist worldviews, when we react to that and respond to that and demonstrate what I believe is the superiority of the Christian worldview to it, then we will have a solid footing for our faith. And so that's what we are trying to accomplish and that's the reason that we're going about it the way we do. Today's lesson is the first of five that will round out the series. in which we're not now really trying to prove that Christianity is true, but actually just trying to show that wouldn't it be wonderful if it were true? And I think that's an important thing because, like it or not, most people don't decide what's true and then go in search of reasons to find what's true and then live that way. They decide the way they want to live, and then they find answers to justify their decision. And all people are prone to that. And a lot of people go into atheism and skepticism because of that. I really didn't like the biblical sexual morality ethic. And I went to college and I wanted to sleep around, and I just found that it was much more convenient and less guilt-inducing to do so under the rubric of a secular worldview where there was no God who had given any legislation regarding moral behavior in this realm. And so you want this, and then you can begin to find all kinds of arguments to support the decision that you made. And of course, that argument can be made against Christians as well. Well, we're just, afraid of coming to terms with the harsh reality that there is no fatherly God who loves us and cares about us, and we want that, so we come up with reasons to explain his existence. So that's a part of the way people think, and I think it is important for us to show that Christianity is not only rooted in reality, that it not only has legitimate reasons to embrace it as truth, but that it is also appealing, that it is also something that matches well with our human nature and our deepest drives and longings. In fact, in these last 5 lessons, here's what we're going to be talking about. Every human being longs for their life to have meaning. We want our life to matter, to have meaning, and we're going to talk about that today. Next week, we'll talk about identity. We need to have a sense of who we are. What is our place in the world? And we're going to talk about freedom. Everybody wants freedom, but what is freedom and what's the best means of securing it? We want satisfaction. We just can't get no satisfaction, and yet we want it. We strive for it. Which worldview provides the most satisfaction? And then ultimately hope. Which worldview, the secular or the Christian worldview, gives us the most hope? So this morning, again, we're going to be focusing on meaning. And I would say that one of the reasons that I believe is because Jesus Christ gives my life meaning, deep, strong meaning that cannot be taken away. And that's one of the reasons that I'm a Christian, unashamedly would say that. Now, I'm going to begin this with a couple of questions that I want all of us to play along with. You don't have to answer out loud. But does your life matter? Now, I think most of us are just going to instinctively respond to that question by saying, of course. Of course my life matters. What kind of question is that? But why does your life matter? What is it about you in particular as an individual that makes you matter? And it's good for Christians to try to grapple with that question and come to some explanations and answers for that. But if you are here this morning, or if you're watching at home, and you do kind of come at it from a secular, atheistic worldview, you especially, I would encourage to answer this question: does your life matter? Is there any meaning to your existence? And if you answer in the affirmative, why do you matter? And do you matter any more than a monkey or a June bug or a rock or the smallest subatomic particle in the universe? Do you matter more than that does? And why, given your presuppositions and worldview, do you matter? And how much do you matter? And how do you know that that's true, that you matter? Maybe another way of asking the same kind of question is, what makes you significant? What makes you count? What do you mean in your short time under the sun on this planet? What does it all mean for you? And those are some really fundamental questions that, again, as I think we lay alongside the secular dominant worldview that is gaining ascendancy here in the West, alongside the traditional Christian and biblical worldview, I think we're going to see that there are some similarities, but some stark contrasts as well. And again, trying to give the secular answer first and to give real answers, not straw men, I've tried to seek and search and find the most articulate and intelligent proponents of the secular worldview, read and listen to what they have to say, and present what I think are their finest arguments in these messages. And I found Sean Carroll, who is a theoretical physicist now living in California, Harvard PhD. And he writes this about the secular view of meaning. He says, we used to, that is humanity, we used to think of meaning and purpose as being imposed from the outside. Now, understand what he's saying. He says, in years gone by, humankind thought that their life had meaning because outside of the universe or from some external source that was greater than we are, valued us and sort of imposed a meaning or purpose on our lives. And he also went on to say that we thought similar things about morality and beauty. But he says, according to the laws of physics, there is no outside to impose any purpose or meaning. Now that's, again, a bald assertion that an atheistic physicist would make. They feel like they've looked pretty thoroughly through the universe and they didn't find God, and so they assume that He is not there, that the laws of physics working on matter the way that they do can explain the reality of the universe just fine without needing to resort to God. And so as a result, he says, we've sort of had to abandon this idea that meaning came to us from the outside or was imposed upon us by a higher being, a God, for instance. And so he goes on to say, but as it turns out, the universe doesn't care. This universe that he's given his life to study, the one thing he can say about it is it doesn't care that he exists or that you exist or that any of us are here. It does not care. It does not even know that we're here. But then he puts it this way, I, however, do care. And so I have no problem saying that meaning and purpose are things that we, human beings, invent. And I've found any number of people who think as Sean Carroll thinks, who virtually say the same thing. And I think he put it as succinctly and plainly as any of them did. Basically, we don't have meaning because any higher being, no God, values us or gives us intrinsic worth. We just find ourselves here, conscious beings, and we care. We notice things and we sort of grow an attachment to them, and I kind of like her and she kind of likes me and it seems to mean something, and so we create or we generate value and meaning. I mean something to you and you mean something to me, or I find a cause that I think is worth devoting my time and energy to, and so by devoting myself to it, I sort of generate some sense of self-worth and justify my existence in this world by the work that I do that's good. And again, even though the term good is a difficult thing for people with this worldview to explain, again, it's a self-generated value. But in essence, he's saying my life matters because I matter to someone else and they matter to me. My life has meaning because of the causes I serve to alleviate the suffering of others. These are just some statements I've heard from others. And one of them says, my life counts because I'm making progress toward goals that I find worthwhile. Now, they can't say that these goals are worthwhile because, again, there is no external authority giving value to anything. But I feel like, bodybuilding, or I feel like learning things, or I feel like alleviating the suffering of other people is a worthwhile way to spend my few years in this life. And since I devote myself to that, and since I seem like I'm making progress toward those goals, I feel valuable. I feel like my life matters. Now, I want to give an illustration of a particular individual who has found meaning through pursuing a cause like this from a very secular point of view. I forget what country she's from. It's one of the Scandinavian countries, very secular nation. Most of you've probably heard of her. Her name is Greta Thunberg, and she's been described as the modern face of radical environmentalism. And I bring her up, she was pictured on the cover of Time a couple of years ago, because in this interview in Time magazine, she sort of gives her story in an interview, and she says that at age 11, she became extremely depressed, so depressed that she virtually stopped eating, she stopped speaking. And though she, through some various therapeutic interventions, was able to manage her depression a little bit, she remained severely depressed for the next 4 years. And then at the age of 15, she says she became a climate activist. And to summarize this article, she didn't say it in exactly these words, but to try to boil it down for us, it basically says this, and I'm being completely fair. She basically says, my life had no meaning before I became an environmental activist. So in other words, she grew up in a moral world and an self-understanding as a secular humanist family, that she was not created by God on purpose for reason or had intrinsic value just by virtue of that. And as she looked around her, she just sort of had this existential angst and despair that there was no purpose, no meaning, and became increasingly just depressed by it until she found a cause. Something bigger than herself that she could devote herself to. And I'm not making any comments here about the worthwhileness of environmental activism. That's not my point. She found something that she felt like would give her life significance and meaning, and she threw herself into it wholeheartedly and has become perhaps the most famous person, even at her young age, in that movement. And I'm very glad, honestly, that she's no longer suffering from depression. But the question is, that I've wondered about this, is the growth of psychological disorders that's really exploded in recent years, especially among young people. Is that related to the loss of transcendental meaning? In other words, if young people like her are growing up and they're told that, again, they're not here for any reason, there's no God that cares about them or gives them purpose and meaning in life, it's not hard to figure out how a young person growing up like that would fall into depression and despair and feel like my life has no meaning or purpose. And along with that, could this be why we are seeing an explosion of radical secular activism pursued especially by young people? If we don't believe that we're special creatures loved by God with intrinsic value, then we will either be depressed or desperate to prove our value by the causes that we promote. That's sort of an interesting sociological side note, but I think bears consideration. So back to our original question, does your life matter? According to the secular point of view, the answer to that is really no, unless I care about someone or something, and if I matter to them or to it. Then my life does have meaning, and only as much meaning as I have feelings of caring about that thing or person, and only to the degree that they have feelings of caring about me. And you also have to take into account that their view of this caring about or someone else mattering to you is in itself just, it's not the function of what we think of as mind or soul or self of a person. It's just a chemical reaction that's going on in the brain. And to the degree that the particular chemical reaction going off in your brain causes you as a biological unit to have some sense of valuing that other biological thing over there, to that degree of feeling about that person as valuable, to that degree your life matters, and only to that degree. Now, the other question was, what makes you significant? And the answer from the secularists must be that the contribution that I make to my chosen causes. the depth of sacrifice, the difference that I'm able to make in Greta Thunberg's example of getting politicians and world leaders to reduce carbon emissions. That's the measure of your value and significance, how much of that you're able to do. So I think that honestly and fairly, this is a understanding of the secularist sense of meaning and worth of the human being. I hope I've represented them well. I think that anyone who holds to that point of view would have to come and say, yes, I recognize that as a fair description of what I think and believe. Now, I would add that that's not nothing. I mean, it's something. But I believe that it is a very fragile and comparatively shallow way of deriving meaning in a human life. The secular self-created meaning is fragile because it can be destroyed in any moment. It's a fragile sense of meaning. Your value, your worth is extraordinarily fragile because just at any moment it can disappear and be taken from you. What do I mean by that? Well, I mean what I think Proverbs 6:15 means when it says, then, speaking of a person's life, disaster overtakes him in an instant. He's suddenly destroyed without remedy. So here's a person the proverb describes, and Proverbs is all about observation. And Solomon just is describing here is someone who's living their life a particular way, and things seem to be going fine. They're making their way down the path of life. Everything's good. They've got their meaning in place. But then suddenly, disaster strikes, and he's destroyed. And he's without remedy. Now, when you think about the secular explanation for how human beings have meaning, what are the ways in which this verse could be true? She doesn't love me anymore and she's leaving. And I derived my value in life from mattering to her, and she no longer cares for me. My value and meaning in life has been destroyed to that degree. I got fired from the job, or I did not get the promotion, or after devoting my life to this activist cause that I've been pursuing, everything has gone wrong and the other side gets the victory. I become sick and get Alzheimer's, and I can no longer remember or care about the people and things that I cared about before. And as that ability diminishes, so does my intrinsic worth and value. I cease to matter any longer. And that is something that is very much more and more coming into play among ethicists at the highest levels who subscribe to this worldview. At both ends of the spectrum, infanticide, Peter Singer, Harvard ethicist, has said, they're not really human yet because they don't have, in every case, because they haven't come at this point to care about others or others to care about them that much, and so we can kind of do with them as we will. And elderly people, again, the Alzheimer's victim, are they really even human anymore? How can we say they matter when nothing matters to them? You find yourself in some very difficult situations. And if something goes wrong, in an instant, everything is destroyed. A car wreck, and all of your meaning is gone. If it's self-created and limited only to what you can care about in this world, then there you go. When I think about Job in the Old Testament, the famous sufferer, we see a man who lost everything. Everything that the secularist says is necessary to live a meaningful life was taken from him. He lost in a moment his children. His vast wealth was taken from him. His health became horribly sick and suffering and misery. His wife's love and respect was withdrawn from him. And I think as I read through it, what bothered Job the most was his reputation as a good person was taken. Everyone who came to him said, Job, you must have done something terrible for this to have happened to you. And you're actually getting what you deserve. And so other people ceased to care about him, and he lost all of the things that he cared about. And so Job, from the secularist point of view, has a now meaningless existence. And yet, what did Job say? This man of faith, as he sat in dust and ashes. It says in Job chapter 1, verse 21, that he said, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." You see, Job still had a connection with the transcendent. He had a connection with the ultimate, with the divine, with God. And he knew that even if everything in this world was taken away from him, he still had that relationship. And that gave some sense of satisfaction and some sense of meaning and some sense of hope to his otherwise shattered life. And so that's why I say that self-created meaning of the secularist worldview is exceedingly fragile. And while not trying to diminish the significance of what Job suffered, his meaning wasn't as fragile because of the ability that he had to connect by faith and in his spirit to the ultimate and timeless God who was the God of his life. And so I think this explains a very important sociological phenomenon that we see today. Secularism is only appealing to those who live in places that have achieved a great degree of peace and prosperity. It's mostly in advanced Western civilizations where secularism is becoming more and more the dominant worldview. And I think it's because we have been successful at alleviating enough pain, and we live in enough peace and have enough prosperity that we're able to sort of convince ourselves that life can be pretty good. Life can have good meaning even without needing God. But what's interesting is that Christianity, I've mentioned this before, is exploding in Africa, it's exploding in the global South, and exploding in Asia. I think it's interesting because there where people suffer a great deal more than we do. They realize that if meaning has to be derived out of the positive emotional connections and experiences I have with other people, that's not a sufficient cause. And I remember watching a documentary several years ago put together by Ben Stein called No Intelligence Allowed. It's a long story as to how that title came about. But there was an individual professor of chemistry who was an atheist. And in the interview, he said he had pancreatic cancer. And he told Ben Stein that as an atheist, when he found that the pain reached a great enough point that his misery index outweighed the enjoyment that he was having from life, that he would end it. And unfortunately, he reveals at the end of the movie that he did. I think it's also telling that Viktor Frankl, in his monumental work, Man's Search for Meaning, is a doctor observing people who were captives in Nazi prison camps, secularist Jews for the most part, those who survived most quickly reverted to some sense of transcendence, something outside of the here and now to attach meaning and significance to their life to, because everything else was gone. Even their dignity had been taken from them. But those who survived anchored themselves and their meaning in life to something beyond this world. Even one, though I wouldn't recommend this exactly, said touchingly that he knew his wife, who had been killed by the Nazis, was in heaven watching him, and he didn't want to disappoint her. And that was the thing that kept him going. We have to have more than what this world alone can offer in such dark times. Well, the secular self-created meaning is comparatively shallow because it draws from a finite source. It's not only fragile because it can be taken in a moment, it's also shallow because it draws from a finite source. Sam Harris, well-known atheist, pushes back on this, and he says that it's the secularists who get more meaning out of this life, not the Christian. He says we must make the most of each conscious moment while we live. Thinking about a future in heaven only robs us of the present on earth. Now again, that only works in a situation in which people are having a rather pleasant life, but I think even then Sam Harris misses the point. In 1 Timothy, maybe he had come across some of the people that Paul was dealing with in 1 Timothy chapter 4 when Paul says that there were various religious groups who were telling people that marriage is bad and food, lots of different kinds of food, you shouldn't be eating them. And Paul says, no, that's the doctrine of demons, and then corrects it by giving this instruction. He says, for everything God created is good, and nothing is to be rejected if it is received with thanksgiving. So you see, the Christian isn't supposed to just ignore the pleasures of this life and think about a future heaven. Yes, he's supposed to be anchored ultimately to heaven and to God, but that doesn't mean that he's oblivious to the joys of this world because they come to him as a gift. He says, God gave each other to us. Your spouse, your children, your food, your clothing, all the good created things are to be received from God's hand as a gift. That doesn't negate the value of them. It just means that we're not placing our ultimate sense of value and meaning in them. And I'll tell you this, Sam Harris and I can stand shoulder to shoulder at the rim of the Grand Canyon. And I think both of us have the capacity to be equally awed by the majesty and wonder and beauty of what we see. But I can enjoy it a little bit further because I can also be given an overwhelming sense of awe and gratitude for the God who made it, who willed it to be such, and gave me the capacity to appreciate and enjoy it. So I don't think we're missing out on anything. I don't think even here that the secularist has the advantage over us in terms of meaning. The fact is that because the secularist has to derive all of his sense of meaning from these finite sources, they have to make gods out of their spouses, their children, their identity, their career, and their causes. And when you make 100% of your meaning out of such limited and finite resources, you have to begin squeezing everything you can out of them, and eventually you squeeze so hard that you kill them. If all my meaning has to be derived from my wife, or from my husband, or from my children, then I'm going to squeeze and squeeze and squeeze on them until they slip through my fingers because I have driven them absolutely crazy. Or I am utterly disappointed because they failed to give me the joy and the meaning that I demanded from them. Because you see, human beings are meaning-seeking creatures. We profoundly yearn for meaning, and we just can't find what we're looking for in finite things. And so when we turn the good gifts that God has given us into God things, we actually destroy them, and they destroy us. And so God says that we ought to not lean the weight of our lives upon these things, but rather enjoy them as blessings from His hand. As we saw in the reading from Ecclesiastes 3, God says He's given these things to us as gifts to be enjoyed. And we can enjoy them most when we receive them from God as His gifts. We will not be constantly obsessed with worry about what if I lose my looks? What if I lose my wife? What if I lose my career, my health, my child? Because the time is coming when we will lose them all. And if we live in the dread of future loss, you'll miss your present joy. But if you entrust them all to God and enjoy them as His gift, not one of them will ever really be lost to you. because we'll grieve their loss, but not as those who have no hope. Because the Christian meaning is ultimately anchored in what Jesus said in John 17:3, this is eternal life, that they know you, the Father, the only true God, and Jesus Christ, whom you have sent. So our meaning is found in our relationship with a transcendent and ultimate being who gives us value and meaning because he chose for us to be here. We're here because it was his pleasure for you to be here. And that's why ultimately every second of our brief little lives in this world does actually count. And every act and every memory that we make matters because none of them are forgotten by God. The eternal God captures every second of our lives in his bottle of remembrance, and he's scrapbooking every year of our lives. And one day he will, when we have grown old and tired and passed from this world, give it back to us in a way that will be ours to cherish forever in an eternal context. And so you matter to God. And you exist because it pleased the Father for you to be here. And that means that you matter more than you can possibly imagine. And so we have two worldviews set before us. The here and now only secularist worldview, or a worldview that is anchored in the reality of God, who is our creator and redeemer and savior and friend. Those are the choices that are before us, and I hope that I've made a good case that you should not give up on God in order to embrace the secular worldview. If you're not a Christian, we encourage you at this time to come, and we'd be glad to study with you and talk to you about what it means to become a follower of Jesus. And if there's a member here who needs the prayers of this church, then we would be happy to do so for you at this time while we stand and while we sing.